Dr. Andrea McNeely is a first-class human nutrition graduate from the University of Ulster Coleraine and has been appointed as a lecturer in sport and exercise nutrition within the Ulster Sports Academy at the University of Ulster Jordanstown. Andrea continues to be actively involved in nutrition education and acts as a consultant sport and exercise nutritionist for many sports teams and clubs throughout Northern Ireland.
You should choose pre-event training meals that are practical, enjoyable, and are based on tried and tested experiences. As you train for the marathon, it is important to get into a regular routine with regards to your eating patterns. As well as that, on the actual race day, it is beneficial for athletic performance to consume carbohydrate regularly throughout the day. Some marathon runners would use the strategy of setting out with 26 jelly beans or 26 jelly babies. And the idea is that at each mile marker, they will have one jelly bean. And this also, apart from increasing blood glucose concentration and reducing the reliance on muscle glycogen, also acts as a psychological aid to get them to the finish line. It is crucial to remember to have your post-exercise snack and your carbohydrate-rich meal at all times after training. If we then think about fluid intake to aid exercise performance, whenever we exercise, the body does tend to increase in temperature, and obviously this has to be maintained within normal levels at 37 degrees Celsius. In order to allow the body to remain at the optimum temperature, we will sweat and lose fluid during our sweat. The aim to prevent exercise-related dehydration is to maintain fluid intake at an optimum level. If we think about what can go wrong with regards to an athlete, whenever we lose approximately 2% of total body weight in the form of sweat, we will see an immediate impairment of exercise. As this gets progressively worse, when we lose between 4 to 6% of total body weight as water, the capacity for muscular work will decline. You also may suffer from heat stress, and in worst case scenarios, when you lose up to 10% of total body weight as water, you could be at massive risk of heat stroke and hypothermia. This can be quite common at the end of finishing a marathon, therefore it is extremely important to get the hydration strategy right. The guidelines for sport and exercise nutrition state that pre-exercise, the aim is to fully hydrate, and this can be achieved by having an additional 400 to 600 millilitres of fluid in the 2 hours prior to exercise. On top of this, anybody competing in sport and marathon training should use urine charts to allow them to gauge their hydration status. But ideally, everything you do in your training should be replicated on the day of the marathon. So it is important to practice this in your long distance running. You need to practice hydration strategy in order to avoid gastrointestinal disturbances, as well as the feeling of being bloated or heavy, which will affect your running capability. During exercise, the aim is to replace fluid losses incurred by sweating. If possible, you should aim to provide a source of carbohydrate in your fluid to supplement your limited energy stores to sustain exercise. This can be achieved by the use of sports drinks. However, it is important to monitor the use of sports drinks, preferably under the supervision of a sport and exercise nutritionist. The guidelines state that for every 15 to 20 minutes of exercise, you should take on board between 150 and 250 millilitres of fluid for that time period. With the case of marathon running, this can be a challenge. However, it is important to make use of all drink stations along the marathon route, whether this is the water stations or the sports drink or nutrition stations. Remember that preparation is the key, so you should aim to replicate this in your training. On the actual day of the marathon, the weather is a crucial factor. Obviously, the warmer the day is, the more you will tend to sweat, so you will need to adjust the amount of fluid that you take in and when. If we think about monitoring the colour of the urine, the target should be to have urine which is of a pale yellow colour. Anything darker than this will indicate dehydration, and in this instance, it is important to recognise this as a cue to take on board more fluid. Following exercise, the aim of your hydration strategy is to replace the potassium, sodium, and the fluid that you have lost during sweating. As well as that, you should try to aim to top up the muscle glycogen stores, ready for either your next training session or your next running event. And this is where you should make full use of the 1 to 2 hour window of opportunity, as during this time the body will be craving carbohydrate and will most readily lay down glycogen stores. Ultimately, the aim is to fully rehydrate, and this is where monitoring the colour of the urine will be most beneficial. As well as having an intake of fluid post-exercise, it is also important to remember that despite celebrations for completing the marathon, you should try to avoid alcohol, as this will further dehydrate you and have a knock-on effect on exercise performance in the coming hours and days. When we think about sport and exercise nutrition, it is important to be prepared at all times. All athletes should always remember the 5 P's of sport and exercise nutrition. These are that poor preparation will precede poor exercise performance. If you follow this advice with regards to carbohydrate and fluid strategies, then it should ensure that your exercise performance and your race time is as you want to achieve.